What's up, everybody? Happy Black Friday. Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I know this might be getting a little bit much by now, but I wanted to identify another issue that I don't think has really been talked about all that much. That's been a fairly major issue for this Packers team and kind of, I guess, sort of an issue with how they've been built. And I talked about this a little bit with Perry Goldstein on Pack's What She Said this week. Had the opportunity to be a special guest over on that show, and it kind of came up organically. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time on it today because I think it's something worth identifying. Most importantly, because I think it's something that Green Bay is going to have to change moving forward, and it's going to have to do a better job of identifying a specific type of player moving forward. And I've identified a lot of the issues in my, the episode when I, got back from my illness of, the Packers suck, here's why. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that one, definitely do so. But one of the issues I didn't state in that episode, and I think is worth talking about, is the fact that this Packers team specifically lacks playmaking, or maybe put in a better way, the Packers' best players, even though they're really, really good, aren't necessarily playmakers. And I think one of the reasons why this season maybe hasn't always gone according to plan, or at least met expectations, is simply because of that. You go back and you look at this roster on paper to start the year, and you look at it and you're like, yeah, I kind of like all these players. Darnell Savage and Adrian Amos looked like they were going to be a nice tandem at safety. Rasul Douglas, Eric Stokes, Jair Alexander, Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Clark, Jerron Reed, TJ Slayton, Devontae Wyatt, Dean Lowry, offensive line that eventually would be Bakhtiari and Jenkins and Myers and, John Runyon Jr., Yosh Nijman, wide receivers that included some, young up-and-coming players like Watson and Dobbs, Alan Lazard, Robert Tonyan coming back at tight end, Jones and Dillon tag teaming at running back, Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. You look at everything as a whole, and you're like, man, I kind of like this roster. I kind of like, they don't really have any definitive weak point. Now, I've talked about in pretty great detail why some of those things have fallen apart. Some injuries have played a part, certainly. Rashawn Gary's injury, the fact that Bakhtiari and Jenkins took a little bit of time to get back, and Jenkins hasn't totally been himself. Bakhtiari's been in and out of the lineup. There's been a lot of different things at play here. But I think if you look at it, kind of almost position by position, or just as the team as a whole, you really struggle to see where your big explosive plays are coming out of, or where they're coming from. Whether that's deep plays down the field, whether that's explosive runs, whether that is interceptions, sacks, turnovers, kick return, punt return, whatever it may be. In order to win in today's NFL, you've got to make big plays. And this is not a team that is set up to make big plays. And clearly the elephant in the room here, the big missing piece has really been Davante Adams, and to a lesser extent MVS and his ability to get deep as well. But clearly the much bigger one is Davante Adams. Davante Adams is the definition of a playmaker. I mean, he can score at any given moment. He can come up with huge plays, even if they're not touchdowns, first downs at a moment's notice. Like, he is constantly open and constantly has the ability to make plays. His run after the catch was underrated. He's just a bona fide playmaker, like one of the best threats in the red zone that you could possibly have. And losing that level of playmaker and not really bringing any playmaker in on any level of the team, offense, defense, or special teams, has quite clearly been one of the bigger issues this season. And some of the stats, when you look at it, not like awful. I'm not going to give you any stat where they're like 32nd in the league or anything, but simply put, just not good enough. The Packers have only 4 plays over 40 yards all season in 2022. That's tied for 19th in the league. The Saints are number 1 with 10. The Packers have generated only 8 interceptions on the season and 3 fumble recoveries. So basically 11 turnovers in 11 weeks. 1 per game isn't good enough. The Packers have 22 sacks, which is 17th in the league. And again, you look at it and like none of those numbers are necessarily like, glaring like 32nd in the league or anything like that. but it's just not good enough if you want to be a high-end competitive team in this league. You've got to get plays from somewhere, right? And they're not generating them in the rushing game. They're not generating them in the passing game with consistency. They're not generating turnovers via interception. They're not generating turnovers via, forced fumbles. They're not generating sacks at a high enough clip. You have to do one of them well. You've got, like I said, you've got to generate explosive plays somehow. They're certainly not generating them on special teams. We know that. And I think when I go back to the point of their best players aren't playmakers, here's kind of what I mean by that. And this isn't to say that they are bad players or that they're not all pro caliber players or anything like that, because some of these guys are extremely, extremely good football players. You know that. But guys like Jair Alexander and Kenny Clark are just phenomenal examples of this. Even to a lesser extent, Rashawn Gary, who is, in my opinion, very clearly on his path to becoming a playmaker this season, or was a playmaker this season prior to his injury. But I just want to give you some comps here. Jair Alexander, you might say like, Andy, Jair Alexander clearly is a playmaker. I would argue when he's playing his A game, he's a fantastic football player. And he's at times, pretty close to a shutdown corner, again, when he's playing his A game, which hasn't been, unfortunately, this season. But when he's his best, he's one of the best cover corners in the league. But you look at his overall playmaking stats. In his career, he has 8 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 0 touchdowns, 1.5 sacks. All right. Just for comparison's sake, Charles Woodson in 2009 alone had 9 interceptions, 3 touchdowns, 4 forced fumbles, and 2 sacks. He had more interceptions in 2019, more touchdowns in 2019, more forced fumbles in 2019, and more sacks in 2009. And in 2009, all those stats, 9 interceptions, 3 touchdowns, 4 forced fumbles, 2 sacks, that were better. All of those statistics individually better than anything that Jair Alexander has done in his career so far. Now, to be fair, Charles Woodson, Hall of Famer, all-time great, and comparing anyone to Charles Woodson is tough, right? But that was the type of playmaker that Charles Woodson was in a season. Jair Alexander's career stats don't match the one good season, like Charles Woodson's 2009 season. Tramon Williams in 2010 during their Super Bowl run, 9 interceptions, 5 fumble recoveries, 1 sack, and a touchdown in the playoff game, of course, against Matt Ryan in the Atlanta Falcons. That was one season, 2010, 9 interceptions. Again, Jair 8 in his career so far. Nick Collins, 2008, 7 interceptions, 3 touchdowns, and a forced fumble just in 2008. So those are the definition of playmaking seasons. Again, it's not to diminish Jair Alexander as a fantastic football player when he's playing his A game, because he clearly is. And we can also argue, all right, well, let's talk about defined roles, right? Because Charles Woodson was put in a playmaking role. Tramon Williams, not necessarily, but teams threw at those players. A lot of times, Jair Alexander doesn't necessarily get the ball thrown his way a ton, which can limit some of the opportunity for playmaking. But at some point, if you're a playmaker, you find ways to make plays. So I get it hasn't necessarily been his 1A job description, but if you want to just compare his career numbers to that of some of the other playmakers in recent years with the Packers, Jair Alexander doesn't come close. Not to say he's not a fantastic football player. How about Rashawn Gary? All right, in his career so far, 22.5 sacks, no interceptions, no touchdowns, 3 forced fumbles. Not bad numbers. And like I said, he was very much on track this year with the way he was playing to being a pretty legitimate playmaker. But let's look at Clay Matthews in 2010. 13.5 sacks, only 9 less than Gary has in his career so far. 1 interception, 1 more than Gary has in his career. 1 touchdown, 1 more than Gary has in his career. And 2 forced fumbles, 1 less than Gary has in his career. So again, you talk about a playmaker, Clay Matthews in 2010, the definition of a playmaker. Rashawn Gary hasn't necessarily come close to that level of production in his career, really so far. Obviously, the 22.5 sacks, really, really good. And you might make the argument too, Andy, sacks are great, but pressures are good. Pressures are really good too. And yeah, Rashawn Gary, some of these guys get good pressure, but you have to take advantage of that pressure on the back end. If it just ultimately results in an incomplete pass and they're not turning into interceptions or, forced fumbles, whatever, that doesn't matter as much. Like, it's great, but like you got to make plays. That's sort of the crux of this entire episode is, yeah, some of the things that all of these players do, from Kenny Clark to Rashawn Gary to Jair Alexander, is really good, but somebody on the team at some point has to make plays, and this Green Bay team hasn't done it, and their best players haven't shown a propensity to do it on a regular level. Kenny Clark, he's struggled through the last 4 games. There's no question about it, but clearly a fantastic football player. But the most sacks he's ever had in a season is 6. He has 4 career forced fumbles. He is now in his 7th season. Cullen Jenkins, not exactly an all-pro caliber player, right? He had 7 sacks in 2010, one more than Kenny Clark has had in his best season from a sack standpoint. Cullen Jenkins, in his 7 seasons in Green Bay, same as Kenny Clark at this point, had 5 forced fumbles, one more than Kenny Clark has in his career. So, again, no question, apples to apples, if you could choose right now, who would you rather have on your team, Kenny Clark or Cullen Jenkins? It is by far and away Kenny Clark. He is the better football player, and he makes a far bigger impact for what he's asked to do. But it just goes to show you, 2010 Cullen Jenkins, who was like the 5th or 6th, best defender on that team probably at best, is creating a similar level of playmaking as Kenny Clark has in his best seasons in Green Bay. And then you can just kind of go down the roster. We don't even necessarily need to compare players at other positions, but like AJ Dillon is a phenomenal example. Like, at times looks like an okay football player. I think this has been an extremely disappointing season for AJ Dillon. And I think we're starting to see that his brand of football, it's really tough to win with because you're not gaining explosive plays. Defenders are just too good. Like, you can be big and muscular and bulky, and that's fine. But if you don't have any sort of breakaway speed or a move that can get you free in the open field, a lot of times you're just going to end up getting the yards that are blocked for you. And that's a lot what we've seen out of AJ Dillon. But to sort of emphasize the playmaking aspect of this, AJ Dillon has 366 career rushing attempts. His longest rush in those 366 rushing attempts, 36 yards. That's not good enough. You have to put the ball in the hands of players that can go out and make plays. AJ Dillon is the antithesis of a playmaker. Can he be good at certain aspects of the game? Can he be a good football player? Sure, but he's definitely not a playmaker. And you might talk about like, well, not every position is a playmaker position, right? So let's talk about David Bakhtiari and Elton Jenkins for a second, because I would argue that especially even like in 2020, let's rewind to 2020 prior to injuries. David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Corey Linsley from left tackle, left guard to center, right? That side of the offensive line. While none of those, it's tough to be a playmaker as an offensive lineman. Those 3 players together was basically like having a playmaker along the offensive line. They were what I would consider, and what I've talked about before, and Mike Wallace talked about before, as a force multiplier. They are making all of the playmakers around them better because that entire left side of the offensive line is dominant. You can run behind it at any given moment. You can get Aaron Jones explosive plays by running behind it. You are allowing Aaron Rodgers more time to throw the ball. You're allowing guys like Devontae Adams more time to get open downfield. They were a force multiplier that made all of the players on the field better, which made it more likely to get explosive plays. David Bakhtiari playing much better now and is still what I would argue to be a sort of a force multiplier on the left side of the offensive line, but there's not enough to go along with it. Elton Jenkins hasn't been good enough, and the rest of the offensive line has been completely inconsistent, so they don't necessarily have that either. And it's really tough to just look at, like, even with that David Bakhtiari playing really well right now, it's tough to look at David Bakhtiari, even though he's playing well, and say, like, he's a playmaker. And it's just, again, it's tough to do as an offensive line. I'm not arguing that. But it just is kind of going to show you, like, the amount of money that they are putting into players on this team, whether it's, Aaron Rodgers, which we'll get to in a second, David Bakhtiari, 2nd round pick into AJ Dillon. They're, arguably their number 1 wide receiver in Allen Lazard. And we'll get into all these players in just a second, but these just aren't guys that are necessarily playmakers. Clark and Alexander we talked about, and that becomes a problem. And then you just go through, again, the rest of the lineup. Adrian Amos, right? he's having a down year. He's having a rough year, no question about it. But even in Adrian Amos's prime, the number one knock on him is like he was consistent, he was steady, right place, right time, made all the right tackles, was everywhere he needed to be, never made plays. And I know there's always exceptions to the rule. His big interception against the Bears in the end zone and some things like that have been a big play here or there. But Adrian Amos is basically like his biggest knock in his entire career, and that he's not a playmaker. Alan Lazard at wide receiver, like he is doing his best with his skill set to generate, some plays downfield throughout the course of his career, but he's a possession guy. Again, he's sort of the antithesis of what you would kind of consider as a playmaker at the wide receiver position. Robert Tonyan, now kudos to the guy coming back from a torn ACL, but he has no juice left. He can't make anyone miss in the open field. He can get down the seam every once in a great while, but Rodgers usually has to throw him open in those situations. He's not a playmaker. Mercedes Lewis can't run. He's a blocky. He's like literally a blocker. Like one of the guys that's on the field quite a bit throughout the course of the game, like literally is basically an extra offensive lineman at this point, and you're using him at one of your 5 skill positions. Definitely not a playmaker. Randall Cobb, certainly not the playmaker that he once was. Sammy Watkins, completely washed. Dean Lowry, not a playmaker. Jerron Reed, not a playmaker. Devondre Campbell, first team All-Pro last season. Deservedly so. Really good football player last year. And it's tough to comment on this season because of the injury. Certainly wasn't playing at an All-Pro level prior to his injury this season. But in his first team All-Pro season last year, really great season. I'm not taking that away from him. 2 sacks, 2 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles. Like that inside linebacker, I'm going to give that to you. Like he had a fantastic season. And again, I'm not taking that away from him. I'm not trying to argue that these are bad football players, but that's like, if that's him as a first team All-Pro, and it's still generating basically like 6 big plays in a 17 game season. Eric Stokes has not been a playmaker. Darnell Savage is a playmaker for the other team. Unfortunately, he is not a playmaker for the Green Bay Packers. Preston Smith, nice player. 5 sacks in 11 games this season. Not on pace for 10 sacks. He has 0 forced fumbles. Again, no interceptions. So you're just not having your so many players on this team play at a level where they're actually able to consistently make plays. Now, there's some players I've left out because there are some playmakers on this team. I would argue that Rasul Douglas, since getting to Green Bay, has been a playmaker. He's played in 15 games for the Packers so far. He has 7 interceptions, 2 touchdowns, a forced fumble, and a sack. That's good. Like that, I would argue that that's through his 15 games. It's not even a full season that he's had in Green Bay to play so far. That's good. Like that's a playmaker. Christian Watson, basically since coming back from his injury the last 2 weeks, has shown he has a ridiculous ability to go out and make plays. That's a positive. Aaron Jones, clearly a playmaker. He needs some help up front to be able to be a little bit more explosive. He's not what I would consider like your super explosive, runner where he's running like a 4.340 and has the ability to take it, 70 yards at any given moment. But clearly a playmaker with the ball in his hands. And Green Bay, like the biggest issue is that Green Bay just doesn't get in his hands enough, unfortunately. Romeo Doubs has shown some ability to be a playmaker. It hasn't been enough yet, and I would not put him in the playmaker category. If you look at his yards per reception, it's extremely low, and he's had some opportunities at big plays that he's let literally slip through his hands. But I think he has the ability to be that, but he is not there yet as a playmaker, but that ability is there. And then that gets you to Aaron Rodgers, who is sort of like I don't even know. I want to call it I don't even know what I want to call it, but like he's the ultimate force multiplier. Let's put it that way. He's what can lift everything up around him, where even if you're missing some playmakers on the outside or your defense isn't up to par, your special teams is making a mistake, he's the MVP that can just sort of, snap his finger and you get a ticket to the playoffs, right? That's the type of player he has been through the majority of his career. But he hasn't been that this year. And I've went through and detailed in previous episodes of some of the superpowers that Aaron Rodgers has lost, generating false starts up front. His hard count, not the same. His ability to run, not the same. His accuracy, I'm sure a broken thumb causing a major, causing issues with that, but his accuracy, not the same. His arm strength, not quite the same. Like he's just not the ultimate force multiplier that he once was and has the ability to just lift everything around him. And it's not to say that he doesn't help other players around him make big plays, because there's been some of that, but it hasn't been consistent enough, and it hasn't been consistent enough to really make up for the lack of playmaking throughout the entirety of the rest of this team. So on paper, going into this season, this team looked pretty solid at almost every position. There's been issues from injuries to just players not even coming close to living up to the level of expectation that was needed out of them, to poor coaching, poor scheme, putting players not in the best position to succeed. There is all of that. We have covered that in detail so far. But there's also the issue that in order to win in today's NFL, you have to have big plays. You've got to generate turnovers. You've got to generate negative plays via sacks or big tackles for loss, things like that. And in order to do those things, get explosive plays in the passing game, get explosive plays in the running game, in order to do that, you have to have playmakers. And Green Bay has some nice potential in Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, and Aaron Rodgers shows some flashes of that magic from time to time. Aaron Jones, definitely a playmaker, but it's not enough. And that is going to be one of the huge opportunities that Brian Gutekunst has in this offseason. And it's going to have to be to find more playmakers for this team. It doesn't have to be the guy that has a 9.9 RAS score, is the most gifted athletic player in the world. Devontae Adams, not that. Like he was not that high, insane athletic player. Like, you just have to find guys. Micah Hyde was a great example of a playmaker for the Packers. Punt returner, safety who would have some ball hawking skills, obviously went on to a phenomenal career with the Buffalo Bills. He was not a great athlete. Like that's a great example of a type of playmaker that you can find. Ted Thompson, for his faults later in his career, did a really great job of, putting that 2010 team together, and really throughout Rodgers' career, whether it was Jordy Nelson, Greg Jennings, Jermichael Finley when he was playing well, Devontae Adams, trying to surround Rodgers with playmakers on offense and getting guys like Clay Matthews and Nick Collins, Sam Shields, Tramon Williams, Charles Woodson, Julius Peppers, like just trying to find guys that would be playmakers for this defense. This has got to be a massive priority for this team this offseason, to find new playmakers on offense, defense, and specifically special teams, so you can actually have a returner that's some level of threat, which they haven't had in years, in order to be able to be just a better football team. Because if you don't have playmakers, right, your margin of error is so thin. Your defense is forced to basically just hold and force punts. Your special teams is not getting explosive plays on your punt returns or your kick returns. You're having errors on special teams, which is, a bigger issue. And then on offense, because you're not getting those explosive plays down the field, and because your defense isn't getting turnovers, you're now forced to go 80 yards every single time. And if you can't get those explosive plays, you're punting away to other teams who do have playmakers as returners, who do have playmakers on offense, who can hit on those explosive plays. So they're able to get there with less, not having to put together 15 play 80-yard drives, and can get there with explosive plays, whereas you are forced to play a near perfect game without mistakes, where you're having to go 15 plays 80 yards in order to actually get touchdown drives and still find a way to be successful in the red zone, where still the not having playmakers becomes an issue even more so down in the red zone. So a very specific problem, a very specific need, and something Brian Gutekunst is going to have to address in a very specific way this offseason. That's going to do it for me. Thanks so much for joining me. Always appreciate you. I'll be right back here tomorrow as we start to break down Packers-Eagles. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.